Hello, my name is Patricia Thornton. I'm at the University of Oxford, and I am the editor of the special issue of the China Quarterly on the CCP centenary. And I have with me today Professor Harriet Evans, who is a visiting professor of anthropology at the LSE and emeritus professor of the Chinese Cultural Studies program at the University of Westminster. She's also the author of a 2020 book called Beijing from Below, Stories of Marginal Lives in the Capital Center. And we're going to be talking today about her article for the special issue entitled Patchy Patriarchy and the Shifting Fortunes of the CCP's Promise of Gender Equality since 1921. So I wanted to begin, Harriet, by asking you, what is patchy patriarchy?
Patchy patriarchy is a term that I formulated on the basis of long-term research I was conducting in a poor, very, very deprived, disadvantaged neighborhood of central Beijing called Dashilar. And this was ethnographic research and archival research and what one could think of as research for oral history of a number of families in this neighborhood over a period of, the research I conducted over a period of 9 years. And patchy patriarchy really was a term that emerged through the course of this research to refer to what to me came across as a very striking paradox between how the women I got to know, who were largely kind of middle-aged or aging, were extremely feisty and independent wage earners who were proud of their capacity to keep their families going, and yet whose husbands were either in jail. On one occasion, in one instance was in jail, another instance was very ill and unable to work and basically unemployable, and yet in front of their husbands and in front of me by definition, because I was observing them, they were consciously, I'm thinking of the adjective, they deferred very, very consciously, even when their husbands and their lovers, or their lover in one instance, was saying, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. You know, why are you interrupting me? You just don't know what you're talking. So even when they were being told that they were rubbish, basically, they deferred to their husband's authority. And to their daughters, they passed on a very, very clear message that their daughters' material security in the future lay with marrying a man who had a stable job and who therefore could entertain the idea of buying or renting a decent apartment. So, you know, in a very incomplete fashion, you know, this seems to me to be indicative of an enduring, revised, very different notion of and practice of patriarchy, which, you know, and the notion of patchy was to refer to how this is not at all patriarchy in a kind of the classical mode that was described by Maurice Friedman, amongst others, referring to classical patrilineal structures of political power and economic power and so on. But nevertheless, inasmuch as their behavior was complicit with and deliberately and consciously complicit with upholding male structures of authority, it was in some form or another, I mean, it's at this point maybe that language is not enough to really indicate a new form of patriarchy. I don't mean by a new form of patriarchy to suggest any kind of relativistic argument that there are different kinds of patriarchies in China. I mean, I think that this is a kind of mediated practice and belief in male authority in very, very changed socioeconomic and indeed political conditions. I would like to say, though, that this notion of patriarchy, that one shouldn't make the mistake of imagining that a patchy patriarchy was simply an effect or a consequence of poverty and scarcity and precarity, and that leaning on a man, even though the women were income earners and, you know, very proud of their capacity to make an income, that leaning on a man meant leaning on a man was a direct, indirect correspondence with conditions of poverty. Far from it. I mean, recent research by young Chinese scholars, and there's one in particular I'm thinking of, about that is based on ethnographic research with highly educated, wealthy young women in Shanghai and Chengdu, indicates that, you know, young women, many of whom had the benefit of study abroad, but who were subscribing to what you and I would consider to be deeply conservative gender beliefs and attitudes.
I did want to ask a little bit more about this notion of patchy patriarchy, because your article also really helpfully covers the centenary, not just simply the 100th year, the contemporary period, but the entire century, I should say, of Chinese Communist Party's existence. And so when you say patchy patriarchy, do you think that this was endemic over the course of that 100 years? Were there periods in which actual feminism was, or a better version of feminism, a more inclusive version, a more progressive version of feminism? Were there periods where it was achieved, and are we seeing a reversion now in the reform era, or even just more recently?
I mean, it's a difficult one in a few sentences to answer. I mean, I think, and this is my view, that inheriting that, you know, gender hierarchy in one form or another, and thinking here of gender in relatively binary terms, is one of the most deeply embedded structures and practices of Chinese society, and has remained so over the entire 100 years of the CCP's existence. And when I say deeply embedded, I mean, I'm talking about practices and beliefs that over centuries, I mean, the young women and the young men or the young men in particular, who set up the Communist Party in 1921, I mean, this was sort of part of their emotional, social, cultural baggage, into which they, discursive baggage, I should say, you know, that they were born into and fed into their own subjectivities through their maturation as political subjects and so on and so forth. So it has been extremely resilient. I would have said almost more resilient than anything else, because it's obviously intersected with ideas about authority, political authority. So I'm not making an essentialist argument here. Of course, it intersects with many other things. I mean, generation, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, educational status, and so on and so forth. But it has and remains something that different generations of revolutionaries and reformers in China have really kind of got stuck with and come up against. And when I say got stuck with, I mean, I think that from, if we're talking about the centenary, the 100 years of the CCP, then from the word go, there were men and women who were deeply, deeply committed to the idea and the practice of gender equality, and who come the People's Republic of China, and we could say in very loose terms that they developed a notion of what could loosely be called feminism, in as much as it addressed issues of gender injustice and gender inequality. Come the People's Republic of China, of course, I mean, this took new form in new laws, in campaigns to improve health, to improve literacy, and of course for women who were coming of age in the 1950s and the 1960s, the legitimacy to hold their head high in public spaces as political subjects and as social subjects who legitimately could be outside in the kind of public sphere, as it were, and treated in terms of labor and employment in what they considered to be roughly equal terms to men. And this was an extraordinary achievement of the Chinese Communist Party. And there's a considerable amount of evidence from scholars, I mean, not only my own work, but the work of other people, to indicate that, women of that generation were quite rightly proud of their, and proud and dignified as new social and political subjects who were in employment terms given equal rights to men. The flip side of that was that the neither law nor the Women's Federation nor policy nor these women themselves really gave much attention to women in the domestic sphere and in the sphere. So women remained those who were doing the lion's share of childcare, of cooking, of domestic work, and so on and so forth. And to the point that many, I mean, Wang Zhong, I think in an earlier article that she wrote for the China Quarterly, I mean, she referred to one woman she interviewed in this context saying, why would I ever have thought of talking about my domestic role? Because it wasn't that kind of stuff that we were being valued for, nor was it for our domestic roles that we valued ourselves as new socialist women. So, that the domestic and family sphere, if you like, of gender equality was basically kind of untouched. The assumption was, and this was an assumption that was well documented in the literature of the time, the assumption was that the state would eventually take over the welfare services, the childcare services, and so on and so forth, that would enable women to be fully liberated from the domestic sphere. And of course, there was a brief period during the early stages of the Great Leap Forward when there were all sorts of experiments with that, but that didn't really get off the ground and were, basically a failure for reasons I can't go into now. But so that was the assumption. And then come the first years of the post-Mao reform era, that assumption in time was completely overturned and replaced by new practices and policies that corresponded with the new political economy, or the shift in the economic strategy and the political economy, according to which women, in a sense, were re-domesticated, and as children welfare and childcare services were privatized, I mean, so women were encouraged, if not coerced, and they weren't coerced, but they were definitely encouraged to, quote unquote, go back home. And in the late 1980s, I think, or the early 1990s, I don't recall the date, there was one, a rising star sociologist in the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, was critiqued by feminists of the time for urging women to go back home in order to alleviate pressure on the urban labor force. But the effect of this up until now has been to really redefine women, or reinscribe women, if you like, as individuals who are subject to both to kind of parental controls and to the controls, or not the controls, the authority of husbands and male partners, in conditions in which it is not their labor. I mean, I'm simplifying a very, very complex argument, but in conditions in which they were increasingly being asked and encouraged to be good mothers and good wives to their husbands and male partners, who were discursively treated as the major income earners. So, and in that context, the Women's Federation has increasingly, in my view, it's really relinquished any claims to represent women's interests in gender justice and gender equality, in as much as the Women's Federation too is party to a policy which encourages women to be good wives and be good mothers, as good examples to the future, the nation's future.
That's wonderful, and well, it's not wonderful. Obviously, it's not a very encouraging news. But if we skip ahead then just a little bit to the current contemporary period, how have women fared under Xi Jinping, and what does that tell us about the party and its priorities?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an even sorrier story, to be very direct and very blunt. And I mean, very recent, since, I mean, what seems to me to be evident under Xi Jinping in a way that is more striking and more prominent than has previously been the case, I think, is the extraordinary threat to male authority, whether it's familial or at the higher echelons of the political hierarchy, that feminism represents. I mean, if we think just of 2015 and the arrest of the so-called Feminist Five for staging public performance protests against women's subordination in marriage and in the home, and then fast forwarding to the recent news that has gone completely viral about Xianze and the case. This is a case, I mean, again, there isn't time to go into it in any detail, but this was of a young woman whose nickname is Xianze, who several years ago brought a case of sexual harassment against a very well-known media celebrity for whom she had been working as an intern. And when she went to the police, claiming that she had been harassed by this man in his dressing room when she was trying to interview him, she was told that he was a very famous person and he did lots of good for the nation and she'd better drop the case. They then got in touch with her parents, and her parents told her not to go public with it. So fast forward to the end of last year, I think, there was a big, so the court, she was then sued for defamation and something else by this man. And she was sued to the tune of a very, very large sum of money, in return for which she countersued him on the grounds of, what was it called? Personality. It was some clause, I don't remember it exactly, but this was before, and as the case was being heard in the Beijing court, there was a large protest outside demanding justice for this young woman. And then by January 2021, the political authorities had inserted a new article into the new civil code, which for the first time defined sexual harassment. So she was not able to use this law in her own defense. I think that there is no, I mean, the issue has not yet been resolved. But I would also, I mean, just in finishing, I mean, I think it's worthwhile pointing out that, I mean, to come back this idea of the, I mean, that is in a sense is indicative of two things. I mean, one, the terror that is inflicted in the hearts of these male leaders and media celebrities by a young woman who is going public in protesting against sexual harassment. But indeed, the terror that is inflicted in these men and the entire kind of political establishment, if you want, at different levels, of the spectre of feminism in the form of young women who are kind of shouting, who are protesting, who are staging public protests and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, actually, even very recently, in the last 2 weeks, there's been a lot of attention from this leftist blogger's essay, Li Guangman, and you know he's been applauding the attack on what he calls sissy boy culture. So this then also links back, I think, to what you were saying about the CCP's inability to break out of thinking of gender in strictly binary terms as well. So, and this is under Xi Jinping,
And then Xi Jinping's, you know, reported comments about how men should, you know, they shouldn't look so sissy and they should look strong and masculine, and which is a form of, you know, masculinity that clearly he aspires to and celebrates.
So do we see any hope for the CCP in improving its position on either the role of women or breaking out of this very straitjacket of thinking of gender in binary terms under Xi Jinping?
I mean, I don't know about the CCP. I mean, of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't all sorts of people who are indeed kind of thinking about and making use of social media to think about the needs of feminism in China in very, very different ways. And there are a couple of young scholars who have come up with a notion of CFEM, which is sort of shorthand for made in China feminism. And they published an article in 2019 Angela Wu and Dong Yige. And they, for the first time in this 100 years, have really kind of moved away from a focus on labor and employment as being the crux of women's emancipation, and are reviving, I mean, they're working on this at the moment, are theorizing a revised version of social reproduction in order to really focus on marriage and reproduction as the core of, you know, what is the stumbling block in thinking about women's emancipation in China.
Yeah. And I, you know, just to interject my own opinion, it does seem rather unlikely that this will be accomplished or even necessarily addressed anytime soon, as they're trying to encourage couples now to have more children. I'm sure you've read about that in the news. They're really attempting to incentivize people to have larger families in order to prevent or forestall a labor shortage in the future. So it does look as though we're set for the time being with a CCP that is not going to be particularly attentive to either the issue of expanding opportunities for women, or in even conceptualizing gender outside of those very narrow traditional binary terms. All of which are very unfortunate.
I would agree with you. I mean, I think one of the interesting things to point out is that the kind of feminists who have, in a sense, inherited it, you know, since 2015, but the feminists who are following the trajectory, I mean, I don't mean that consciously, but, you know, treading the same kind of path that was established by the Feminist Five in 2015 and before, that they come out of an activist experience in LGBTQ plus activism. So they themselves are moving away from thinking about gender in binary terms. But I agree with you. I mean, I think that certainly under Xi Jinping, I mean, I do not think that there's much of a hope for imagining that, you know, gender will be thought in more imaginative terms.
And on that unhappy note, I guess we should bring this to an end. Thank you so much for talking with me, Harriet.
But I will say one thing, though, I mean, just in ending, to bring it full circle, which in the 1921, you know, the Chinese Communist Party was born out of the experience of 1919 and the May the 4th movement, when, you know, the focus of the May the 4th understanding of women's burden and women's subordination was on marriage and family and reproduction. So in a sense, you know, the Dong Yige and Angela Wu's new theorization of social reproduction in refocusing issues around women's subordination and emancipation on marriage and reproduction, is brought it kind of almost full circle.
Oh, and full circle is a good note on which to end. Thank you so much, Harriet. I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Thank you.